You ever have one of those moments where your entire world shifts in a single sentence? That's what happened to me. 1 second I was sitting in the all-hands meeting, sipping burnt office coffee and thinking about how I'd survived yet another week of corporate chaos. The next second, my name was called not for recognition, not for promotion, but for humiliation. Emily Cooper, the CEO, said, his voice booming through the mic, your role has been eliminated as part of restructuring. Effective immediately, he didn't even look at me when he said it. He just kept reading off his little script like it was nothing. The room went silent. Hundreds of employees, people I'd worked with for years, turned to look at me. Some with sympathy, others with relief that it wasn't their name. I felt heat rush up my neck, but I forced myself not to cry, not here. Not in front of him. You see, I wasn't just some random employee. I was the backbone of the company's operations system. For 3 years, I built, refined, and monitored the architecture that kept their clients' accounts moving millions of dollars of transactions, all running smoothly because of me. And this man had the audacity to cut me loose, publicly, like I was disposable. I gathered my things in silence, every click of my keyboard as I shut down sounding like a drumbeat of rage. He thought firing me in front of everyone would make him look strong, smart, like he was in control. What he didn't realize was that the second he pulled that stunt, he'd set the clock ticking on his own destruction. Because here's the thing about me, I don't forget. And I don't forgive. I walked out of that office with my head high, but inside, I was burning. My chest felt like fire, my thoughts racing with every sleepless night I'd given that company. Every holiday I'd skipped, every weekend I'd worked late just to make sure his empire didn't crash. And the irony? That same empire was already standing on a trapdoor, one I had built without even realizing it. See? When you're in charge of the system, you see everything. The weak points, the shortcuts, the secrets they hope no one ever uncovers. And in their arrogance, they never once thought to treat me like I was essential. They just assumed I'd keep the machine running forever, quietly in the background. But I wasn't background. And I wasn't quiet anymore. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my laptop. I still had access, of course I did. They hadn't even thought to revoke it yet. My fingers hovered over the keys, my mind racing. I could make one keystroke, maybe two, and everything would freeze. Every transaction, every client, every contract. Do you know what a crisis like that costs a company this size? About $100,000 an hour. Every single hour, I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. They wanted to embarrass me publicly. They wanted to take away my dignity, fine. But I was about to take away something they could never get back. This wasn't just payback. This was a reckoning, and I promised myself right then and there the next time the CEO heard my name, it wouldn't be because I'd been fired. It would be because I ended him, asterisk for 2 days after the public layoff. I did the thing every wrong person does first. I simmered. I replayed the meeting in my head, watched the way his eyes slid over the room. How he enjoyed the spectacle. I imagined headlines about his decisive leadership, and the way shareholders would nod and smile while my name disappeared from their lips like it had never mattered. Then I stopped imagining and started planning. You have to understand what it felt like to be the one person who could look at the machine and see its bones. When you build the guts of a system, you don't just memorize menus and buttons. You know the rhythms, what normally hums, what stutters when it's tired. The tiny hiccups that signal something bigger. That knowledge sits with you like a second pulse. I'd spent years keeping that pulse steady for other people. And now they dismissed me in the most public, humiliating way possible. I wasn't naive. I knew revenge stories could turn ugly. I knew the line between justified wrath and reckless harm was thin. Still, every time I pictured the CEO's smug face, something cold and precise clicked into place. This wasn't going to be about drama or petty payback. It was going to be surgical. It was going to be about making them feel in a way they couldn't spin away. The consequences of treating people like expendable parts. First things first, I documented. Not because I was already in a courtroom, but because my brain works in evidence. I pulled every memory into a file, conversations, offhand remarks, the small favors I did that had been passed off as expectations. I wrote dates. I wrote names. I wrote the little lies that formed their business as usual narrative. It calmed me. It gave me shape. Next, I rebuilt my support. After being fired, you realize who your people are. Some former co-workers reached out with the kind of messages people send when they don't want to be implicated. So sorry. Talk soon. Others sent something else entirely, whispers of trouble inside the company. A quiet acknowledgement that they'd seen what I saw and had been too scared to speak up. A few of those whispers turned into conversations. We met for coffee in corners of the city where nobody observed more than the barista and a stray pigeon. We spoke in hypotheticals, in half jokes that were actually checks for courage. It helped to know I wasn't the only one who'd watched the house of cards wobble. There was a practical side to all this, too. You don't walk into a crisis expecting chaos without a safety net. I updated my resume, said yes to recruiter calls, and quietly interviewed with a startup that actually seemed to value expertise more than optics. If the plan I was formulating worked, I wanted a place to stand when the dust settled. That was not compromise, it was strategy. I also had to manage the heat. Public firings leave you vulnerable, angry exes, bitter rivals, opportunistic managers who think they can make a martyr of you or a villain, depending on how it plays. So I learned to speak softly in the right rooms and loudly enough in the right channels. I practiced telling my story plainly without the theatrical fury that makes people tune out. When you want people to listen, truth spoken steady wins more converts than a tantrum ever could. Then there were the nights, those long, dark hours when everything else dissolves and your decisions feel enormous. I'd sit with a cup of coffee gone cold and feel the weight of responsibility. What I had in my hands was not just an opportunity for revenge. It was a responsibility. If the system faltered, innocent people could feel the sting. Clients, contractors, junior staff who showed up every morning to do their jobs. That thought kept me awake more than any fear of legal repercussions. It made me more deliberate. It tempered the bile into method. So I didn't rush to break things. I designed moves that would expose, not annihilate. The company had been built onto pillars, performance and perception. They expected the first to hold and relied on spin to fix the second. If I could show the world that the performance was a house of cards one, that their CEO kept propped up with arrogance and shortcuts, then perception would follow. People would stop buying narratives. Investors would ask hard questions. Clients would demand answers. The route would become obvious. Part of the plan involved letting small fractures show up in public, but only in ways that wouldn't endanger lives or sensitive personal data. Errors that couldn't be brushed off as tech hiccups. Missed deliverables that exposed their overreach. Nothing violent. Nothing catastrophic, just a steady stream of failures that pried at the veneer until it cracked. It was petty sounding when I said it out loud, but the outcome wouldn't be petty at all. I also used the one advantage a layoff gives you, invisibility. People assumed I was gone, that my access was revoked. They assumed I'd be broken or bitter enough to disappear. That assumption became my ally. They celebrated their triumph without checking the fine print. And that was their first mistake. There was a moment, a specific night, where I sat and almost called a former manager inside the company someone I trusted despite the culture. My finger hovered over the contact. If I'd called, he might have warned them and the entire arc of the story would have changed. I thought of how Stephanie loved to stage manage narratives, how she'd probably throw a gala and plaster her smile onto every column inch before morning. I pictured her being praised for decisive cuts, not blamed for thinly veiled sabotage. That was when I knew the only way this could end was if not clean, then at least honest. I didn't want revenge hidden in the dark. I wanted the world to see the mechanics of what they'd built. So I started seeding the truth in the right places. Anonymous tips to industry bloggers who hated the CEO's grandstanding. Confidential notes to former clients who deserved to know the risks they were shouldering. Quiet conversations with internal staffers who, once they owned the knowledge, became small but crucial allies. It wasn't glamour, mostly it was relentless, dull work. But that's how most empires fall, not with one dramatic blow but with 1,000 small stresses that show the structure's weakness. And all the while, I kept my head down about the biggest lever I had. I learned to be patient. I watched numbers. I watched reactions. I watched the boss's speeches morph from confident to defensive. I watched his PR team scramble. I watched how quickly a narrative shifts when the data stops supporting it. There's something oddly poetic about sitting on the periphery of your own creation, watching it begin to wobble. Maybe revenge is childish. Maybe some would call me cruel. I call it overdue accountability. By the end of that week, a single email chain had been enough to start a ripple. By the end of the month, those ripples were getting bigger. I didn't celebrate when the first client raised a red flag. I felt a pang, instead a reminder of the cost. But I also felt a steadying satisfaction. The truth was working in its quiet, inexorable way. They'd laid me off to look strong on the outside. They didn't realize that strength wasn't built on cheerleading and press releases. It was built on reliability. And once reliability is called into question, the rest is performance art. I slept that night with a firm, exhausted sense of purpose. The clock was running. They didn't even know the rules had changed. *, you know how people say, revenge is a dish best served cold? They're wrong. It's not cold, it's calculated. It's patient. It's watching your opponent dig their own grave with a smile on their face. And you're just standing there with the shovel behind your back. By the start of the next quarter, Things were already cracking. I'd seeded the doubts carefully, a few discrepancies in reporting, delayed data reaching key clients, invoices that didn't match expectations. Nothing huge, nothing catastrophic, just enough to make people raise their eyebrows. And then, the big one hit. I was at home, eating leftover Chinese takeout on my couch, when my phone buzzed. One of my quiet allies still inside the company messaged me, "Emily, you're not gonna believe this. The system froze during a client audit. They've been down for almost 2 hours." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because this was exactly the kind of weak point I'd seen coming. That system wasn't designed for the kind of volume the CEO had promised investors. He'd been overhyping performance numbers for months. And without me constantly patching the cracks, it was inevitable things would collapse. The cost of downtime for that client? Roughly $100,000 an hour. Multiply that by 2 hours. And suddenly the company had just burned through more money than my entire salary for a year. And it wasn't stopping there. I leaned back on the couch, chopsticks in hand, and whispered, "Clock's ticking." By the time the system came back online, panic had set in. Clients don't care about excuses, they care about losses. One client threatened to walk. Another demanded immediate compensation. The CEO's golden boy image was starting to tarnish, and for the first time, the cracks weren't invisible anymore. They were public. Here's the thing about corporate America, it runs on perception. Investors don't need to see failure to smell it. Rumors move faster than memos, and the moment Wall Street thinks you're wobbling, you're finished. I knew this, and so did Stephanie, the coup who had pushed hardest for my firing. She'd been strutting around the office ever since I was humiliated, telling people how she'd cut dead weight and streamlined operations. But when the system collapsed, all eyes turned to her. The system she bragged about saving money on was now bleeding cash at $100,000 an hour. I wasn't there in the office, but I heard the stories. She stormed into the server room in her designer heels, barking orders at the IT team, demanding answers no one could give. The staff whispered words like meltdown and nightmare and unsalvageable, and meanwhile, the CEO, her husband, was on the phone with furious investors, trying to put a band-aid on a severed artery. Me? I sat in my apartment, sipping wine, watching the news tickers scroll across CNBC. Nothing major yet. Just a small headline, tech firm faces unexplained downtime during client audit. But I knew what was coming because the truth was, this wasn't a what-I'm glitch. It was a pattern. I had designed the system to be stable as long as I was there to tend it. Without me, it was like a high-performance race car with no mechanic. Eventually, something important was going to blow, and that's exactly what happened the next week. This time it wasn't just downtime. It was data errors, figures not aligning across platforms, contracts being flagged, clients demanding to know why their financials looked different, depending on which report they pulled. In business, numbers are everything. Once trust in numbers is gone, the entire foundation crumbles. Investors noticed. They always do. Stocks dipped. The CEO went from strutting on magazine covers to sweating in shareholder meetings. Stephanie stopped posting smug LinkedIn updates and started sending midnight emails. That sounded more like desperate prayers than strategy. And through it all, I kept my distance. No fingerprints, no trace, no reckless moves. Just quiet patience as the system they stole from me turned on them like a beast. They never understood. I'd walk past their building sometimes late at night, lights still glowing on the upper floors. I imagined the chaos inside, people huddled around screens, phones ringing off the hook. Stephanie's voice sharp and panicked while the CEO tried to keep his composure. And I'd smile. Not because innocent employees were suffering, believe me. I hated that part, but because I knew the pain at the top was finally real. When they humiliated me, they thought I was just one person, a replaceable cog in their shiny corporate machine. What they never realized was that I had been the machine. Without me, they weren't strong. They were hollow. And now, every hour they struggled, every client they lost, every dollar that vanished into the void, it was my silent testimony. A living reminder of what happens when arrogance blinds you. The countdown had begun. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The first rule of corporate survival is this: keep it quiet. Problems happen, sure, but you bury them under buzzwords and carefully worded press releases. You make the shareholders believe everything is under control, even when the building is on fire. But by the time week 4 rolled around, this fire was too big to smother. It started with a leak. A journalist from one of those tough, no-nonsense financial outlets got their hands on an internal memo. The memo detailed unexpected outages and revenue loss incidents. It wasn't supposed to see daylight. But someone inside, maybe one of my allies, maybe just an exhausted staffer who'd had enough, passed it along. That article hit the internet like a grenade. Tech darling faces internal chaos, millions lost in system failures. By noon, 3 more outlets picked it up. By evening, CNBC ran a segment with a bright red ticker at the bottom of the screen. CEO scrambles amid ongoing tech crisis. I was sitting in my apartment, watching the broadcast with popcorn in my lap when they showed his face. He looked nothing like the polished executive who'd once sneered my name into a microphone. His tie was loose, his jaw tight, sweat beading at his temple. And Stephanie, his partner in both business and life, was conspicuously absent from the cameras. It wasn't just a glitch anymore. It was a scandal. Clients started pulling out, not quietly but loudly. Lawsuits were whispered. Investors demanded emergency calls. The company, once a rising star in the industry, was suddenly radioactive. And the best part? None of it could be traced back to me. I hadn't touched a line of code since the day I was fired. All I'd done was stop. Stop fixing their shortcuts. Stop covering their lies. Stop protecting the empire they'd built on shaky ground. The system wasn't failing because I broke it, it was failing because they never knew how to run it without me. And now the world was watching. I remember walking into a downtown cafe one morning, grabbing my coffee and hearing two guys in suits talking at the next table. Did you hear about that company? One said, they're hemorrhaging money like $100,000 an hour. No way, the other replied. What happened? Bad leadership. They cut the wrong people. I smiled into my latte. If only they knew. Meanwhile, inside the company walls, Stephanie was unraveling. She built her reputation on being the fixer, the one who made problems disappear. But this problem wasn't disappearing, it was multiplying. She screamed at the staff, fired two junior managers in a single week, and sent an all-company email that read more like a manifesto than a memo. People whispered about her breakdown in hushed tones, and the CEO? He doubled down on denial. At a press conference, he looked straight into the cameras and said, "This company is stronger than ever. Our systems are resilient. We are addressing minor technical issues and our clients remain confident." But even as he said it, the stock ticker at the bottom of the screen showed the truth, shares plunging, investors fleeing. The irony was almost too delicious. He had fired me publicly to look powerful, to prove a point. Now, his downfall was just as public in every headline, every news anchor, every whispered rumor at cocktail parties across the city was another nail in his coffin. And then came the cherry on top. A congressional committee announced it was launching an inquiry into whether the company had misled investors about the strength of its systems. The same systems I had built. The same systems Stephanie had bragged about streamlining when she cut me loose. When I heard the news, I actually laughed out loud. Here it was, the spotlight they had craved so badly. The fame and recognition they had fought to hoard. Only now, it wasn't awards or praise shining on them. It was scrutiny. It was judgment. And me? I was invisible, safe, watching from the shadows as the empire collapsed in broad daylight. For the first time since that humiliating day in the all-hands meeting, I felt my chest lighten. Justice wasn't some distant dream anymore. It was here, unfolding in real time. And the people who thought I was nothing were finally seeing how wrong they had been. But what I didn't know yet was that the final act, the one that would end everything, was coming faster than even I had planned. Because when people are desperate, they make mistakes. And Stephanie and her CEO husband were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. Asterisk, by the time summer rolled around, the company was no longer the golden child of Wall Street. It was a cautionary tale. Every week brought new headlines. Tech giant loses $45 million in outages. Major client terminates contract amid data chaos. Congress investigates possible fraud in tech firms' reporting. And yet, inside their ivory tower, the CEO and Stephanie were still pretending they could fix it. I almost admired their delusion, almost. Stephanie, especially, was coming undone. I heard from one of my former colleagues that she'd started calling emergency meetings at 2 a.m, demanding solutions nobody could give her. She barked orders like a general at war, but her troops were exhausted, overworked, and starting to turn on her. Rumor had it one VP actually walked out mid-meeting, slammed his badge on the table, and told her, "This is your mess. Clean it up yourself." The CEO wasn't faring much better. He'd lost weight, his suits hanging loose on his frame, his once polished speeches stumbling into defensive rants. Investors who once fawned over him now grilled him on live calls, asking why the company was losing $100,000 an hour. He tried spinning it as short-term turbulence, but nobody was buying it anymore. I should have felt sorry for them. But every time I remembered the humiliation of that day, my name broadcast like a warning. My dignity stripped away in front of hundreds of people, my sympathy evaporated. This wasn't just karma. This was justice. Still, I knew the story wasn't finished. The company was wobbling, yes, but it hadn't fallen. And if I wanted to make sure they never walked away from this unscathed, I needed one final move. So I went back to the files. You see, during my years building their system, I hadn't just learned the architecture, I'd learned the culture. I knew which corners they cut. I knew which numbers they massaged before presenting them to investors. And most importantly, I knew which promises they made publicly that their systems couldn't actually support. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't about to send an anonymous bombshell that could be dismissed as disgruntled employee nonsense. No, I built my case carefully. Piece by piece, screenshots, emails, reports, memos, proof that the CEO and Stephanie had knowingly sold a dream that the company couldn't deliver. It wasn't sabotage, it was exposure. And when I had enough, I sent it not to a blogger, not to a tabloid, but to the congressional committee already sniffing around. The timing couldn't have been better. They were in the middle of their hearings, the CEO preparing to testify under oath about the strength and resilience of their systems. My evidence landed in their inboxes just days before, and suddenly, the story wasn't just about outages or lost money. It was about fraud. When the news broke, it was everywhere: CNN, The Wall Street Journal, even late-night comedians making jokes about the tech king who built his castle on sand. I watched Stephanie's face on TV the night the story aired. She looked hollow, her once perfect mask cracked beyond repair. And the CEO? He looked like a man who knew the walls were closing in, no exit left. The best part? Nobody knew I was behind it. Not the CEO, not Stephanie, not even my closest friends. To the world, I was just the woman they'd humiliated and discarded, invisible, forgotten. But in reality, I was the ghost pulling the strings, and as the company burned in public, I knew the final act was approaching. The hearings, the testimony, the moment the CEO would have to sit in front of the entire country and answer questions he couldn't possibly survive. And me? For the first time since all of this began, I'd be there. Not in the shadows, not behind a screen, sitting in that room watching him sweat under oath, knowing that my truth was finally the blade at his throat. They thought they destroyed me, but I was about to show them what real destruction looked like. The congressional hearing room was colder than I expected. Not the temperature though. Yeah, the air conditioning was blasting, but the atmosphere. It wasn't just a meeting. It was a stage. Cameras lined the back walls, reporters filled the press rows, and every seat in the gallery was packed with people waiting for the spectacle. At the center sat the man who had once humiliated me. The CEO. His suit was immaculate, but his face told the truth. Gray around the edges, jaw clenched so hard you could see the muscle twitch, eyes darting like a trapped animal. For a man who had once thrived under the spotlight, he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. And next to him, Stephanie. No longer the confident fixer, no longer the queen of her carefully crafted empire. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. But her expression betrayed her, hollow, tight. A mask that was cracking under the weight of everything. I sat just a few rows back, close enough to see the beads of sweat forming at his temple, close enough to make sure he saw me when he turned his head, and he did, for one split second. His eyes locked on mine. I smiled, not smug, not cruel, just calm. And I watched realization flicker across his face. For the first time, he understood. The committee chair cleared his throat and began. Mr. Reynolds, you are here today to answer questions regarding the financial and operational failures of your company, including potential misrepresentation to investors and clients. The questions started basic. Numbers, dates, promises made in earnings calls. But quickly, they sharpened. Mr. Reynolds, were you aware of the vulnerabilities in your systems at the time you presented to investors? Can you explain why internal reports show repeated failures that were never disclosed publicly? He stammered. He deflected. He tried spinning the story, but every time he opened his mouth, they hit him with something harder. And then it happened, the moment I'd been waiting for. Mr. Reynolds, one of the congresswomen said, holding up a folder. We have documentation provided to this committee that suggests you and your executive team knowingly misrepresented the reliability of your systems, while simultaneously cutting staff critical to their stability. Are you prepared to explain this evidence? That folder, my folder, the one I had so carefully built, filled with proof of every lie they told. The CEO froze. Stephanie's face went pale. The cameras zoomed in, catching every twitch, every bead of sweat, and in that silence, in that heavy, suffocating pause, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day I was fired. Relief, because this was it. The end, not just whispers or rumors, not just clients leaving quietly. This was truth, undeniable, broadcast to the entire country. The CEO tried to recover, but it was over. His voice cracked. His excuses sounded pathetic. The committee pressed harder, their voices rising, their patience thinning. By the time it ended, everyone in that room knew what he was, not a visionary, not a leader, but a fraud. When the gavel finally struck, I stood up. I didn't linger, didn't gloat. I walked out quietly, my heels clicking against the marble floor. My heart light for the first time in months. Outside, the media swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones shoving toward faces that weren't mine. They weren't looking for me. They didn't know who I was. And that was exactly how I wanted it, because revenge, real revenge, isn't about being seen. It's about watching justice hit exactly where it belongs. Later that night, I poured myself a glass of wine, turned on the TV, and watched the coverage. Analysts predicted the CEO would resign. Lawsuits were lining up. Stephanie's name was being dragged through the mud alongside his. The empire they'd built, the empire they humiliated me to protect, was burning down. In front of millions of people. And me? I wasn't broken. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't expendable. I was free. They fired me to make themselves look powerful. But in the end, their arrogance destroyed them. And all I had to do was let the truth speak for itself. As I closed my laptop and leaned back, I whispered to the empty room, checkmate.